Its simplicity is very hard to achieve. Sometimes you could have a lot of money, you could build a lot of technology and still end up solving the wrong problem. Eventually, APIs are going to be a fundamental skill for all knowledge workers. The benefits of APIs are not just limited to the technology industry. India has been a leader in actually providing APIs. The UPI payment interface, the Aadhaar APIs are all fantastic examples.
Welcome to SaaS Scions, a collaboration between Business Insider India and AWS. I'm Felipe LeMaitre. I'm the director of AWS Developer Relations, and I'm very excited to interview Abhinav Asthana. Abhinav is the CEO and founder of Postman, and I'm a fan of Postman, so I'm very excited to be here with you, Abhinav, and talk a little bit about your trajectory, the company, technology, a little bit of everything.
Thanks for having me here, Felipe. I'm very excited to be here.
Thank you for joining us. So let's start perhaps on your story. You have founded several companies, and I wonder, was there any learning from your first experiences as a founder that was very useful as you created and grew Postman?
Well, that's a great question to start. So I would say like all of it, just for listeners, probably, we built in my previous company a mobile phone app that was supposed to capture, panoramas, and our goal was to, at that company to create like this whole virtual view of the world that people could, go from one place to another just virtually on their phones. And it was very ambitious, but we really lacked, I think, a lot of things along the way. I think the first place I would have started was really narrowing down on a customer or a user problem before really thinking about big picture vision problem. I think, we had a lot of learnings on how to build the right product, how to kind of take it to consumers. What do they really like? What do they not like? And we often found out that our initial assumptions were pretty wrong, and we were just not humble enough to accept it. We kept kind of digging our heels, and we kept focusing on the wrong problem. So I think the first lesson was to really be humble about what you're putting out, and learn from your mistakes, and really focus on the user or the customer. I learned a lot around team building, like how to put the right team around you, how to keep them motivated. Ultimately, you're as successful as the team that you have around you and who's working on the product. So, had a lot of lessons there. Had a lot of lessons on, burnout, and, you can work 16 hours, 18-hour days, but still not get product market fit. So I took all of those learnings. And, when we started Postman with my co-founders, Ankit and Abhijit, we started with the very first one thing, which was, are we solving a real problem? Who are we solving for? And really focused on things like step by step, without even thinking about, starting another company, for instance. We're really focused on solving a real problem, which then led to us, having to be forced to start a company. So I could talk about just that for the next 1 hour, but I would say, it just taught me that, sometimes you just have to be in the right market, solving the right problem, and have a great team, and you should not be too arrogant about yourself. So if once you're successful, you kind of lose that. And I think all of my experiences and my past failures hopefully keep me grounded.
That's a great response. Thank you for sharing. I wish I had some of those insights when I started a startup. That was the beginning of my trajectory. It was not very successful, so I could have used a lot of the insights that you have. Hopefully they are useful for others. Web development, web application, web services, that sort of stuff. It was beautiful experience. I loved it. And I made so many mistakes that unfortunately I could never carry them to a second opportunity, and I changed for a different world, which I'm loving as well.
You're always learning, right? So
you are, yeah. One thing we share, I think, is love for simplicity. And I think that's one of the things that you talk in different interviews. And I also appreciate the it's elegant and it's beautiful and it's powerful and it's easier to communicate all of that. I wonder how do you keep things simple when everything's growing? Like your customers are growing, your markets are growing, employees are growing. How do you keep it simple?
Its simplicity is very hard to achieve, right? It's like, when something is right, when there is, it's not like when there is more to add, but when there's nothing left to take away, that kind of quote. I don't know who it's attributed to, maybe Dieter Rams. But, I found out, and this is some of my experiences kind of growing, as a developer in India and kind of the companies around me. Like I always used to wonder, why don't great products come from, like people who are around me? And I always saw that there is always more to do when it comes to software, right? It's a bunch of things in our minds, and you always want software to do more. You want more features, you want more capabilities. And what happens is that when that software, artifact like reaches a certain level of scale, it becomes very hard to balance, the needs of like each of those different constituents, you know and it becomes extremely hard to really take a decision at times, and then when you can't take those hard decisions, I've often seen, you start adding modes, you start adding configuration options, you start adding like those, command line parameters or things stuck inside, menus. And over time, what I saw software products kind of do was, this is like complexity that just keeps, getting swept under the rug, and then it just explodes out, right? And it's just like there's no way to then even, use the product because you don't know where to start. And I think for me, I was very inspired by, a whole range of different things. Of course, Google search, iPhone, all of those devices in the consumer world were very inspiring. And I had this benefit of actually trying to design a product for consumers who have very little time on their hands, and they just, click a button on and move on if it doesn't work. And I just felt like in enterprise software or even in developer software, like that, like people don't do that. You all like, even within, if we shipped some features today actually that actually allow people to remove some buttons from the interface, because some, users were overwhelmed by it. And I found out like, we still have 2000 features to build that people want us to build. So, we have to do that hard job, right? We have to understand, how is our product used? Like I use our product every day. I have it open across, my house. I have like 3 laptops, and every time I go, I just try the new user experience. I try sending a request. I try building something, and you find out that, complexity has come back again. Because you hired all those employees and they have to build those features, and nobody's taking the hard call to, remove them. So, like a simple rule I think we follow is like if we have added something, we always think about, are there things we can remove? uh, Oftentimes in practice, I've found out that, you know, people will not automatically come and ask you to remove things. You have to do it for them. And like once you remove it, everybody feels like, why didn't it happen before, right? It's like kind of having like stuff around your house. Like you're like, oh, maybe you start thinking like, oh my, I need a bigger house. I need containers. I need this or and that. And once you clear out the crap, then you're like, wow, this this house is pretty nice. Why didn't I do that before? So it's kind of like that mentality. But it's simple to experience. It's very, very hard to practice, and we have had our fair share of issues. Customers sometimes have like, why did you take that away? And we have to explain it to them that this new way, as we have talked to hundreds of other customers, is probably better, and it keeps the product simple. And we have made our fair share of mistakes too, but you kind of learn along the way. But that's how we've kind of gone about doing it.
Okay. Are there any frameworks or principles or books that you recommend your team, or how do you bring this philosophy that you just described and embed it in a growing company?
So I like Don't Make Me Think by Steve Krug. I think if I'm quoting it right, I think that's one of the first books I read. Books by Dieter Rams, like The Principles of Simple Design, Laws of Simplicity by John Maeda. If again, I'm pronouncing all of these things right, but these are the book names. So Less is More by Dieter Rams, laws of simplicity. Recently, I read this book, which I like a lot, called Subtract by Lydie Klotz, I think. And it talks about the psychological reasons of why we are, as a society, as a species, always prone to adding, and why don't we just automatically subtract? So I think those are the books I found useful to validate some of the things that we found successful in our product.
That's great. The last one seems especially interesting. I'll read it. The one that I love in this topic is essentialism. I don't know if you have encountered it, but it's the one that I recommend the most. So if you want to take a look.
I'll keep a note of it. I'll check it out.
So let's change gears and maybe let's talk about your story. I think it's a beautiful, extraordinary, inspirational. Like it has all the elements. I wonder, coming from such a extraordinary story, what's your advice for other founders that are not in the US, that don't come from privileged situations? Like we're used to talking about startups perhaps in a very US centric, middle class and above type of person that has access to a lot of networks and people, which is not the case for a lot of us, right? So I just wonder if in your different discussions you have distilled a few insights for these type of founders.
Well, thank you for all the compliments. I would say that first of all, I've been supported by a lot of people in my journey. My parents, my family, and now I got married about in 2017. So my wife, all you require all of that support, both inside of work and outside of work. Otherwise, you just can't do this alone. My parents were work from a very early age. Uh, you know, encouraged me to really focus on building stuff rather than entertainment with computers. Like my father was like, if you to get that one game, you have to work really hard, and he had a lot of excitement towards computers, so I kind of absorbed a lot of that. So I think, before I go into the answers, which against like what I learned, I would say, you one way or the other, you need a supporting environment, whichever place you're in. I think there are very rare founders probably who have, battled all odds. Fortunately, I had a lot of support around me. But I think, as I, I mean, it's not been that long, and I have a lot of years ahead, hopefully. But when I look back at, how things have gone in my journey, I think the first thing has been, like really taking initiative to just build. Like a lot of people wait a lot. They do a lot of analysis. They draw a lot of charts. They do a lot of interviews. But it's kind of like when you get down to put pen to paper. If you're writing a book, like right? So for me, that was basically like coding or designing, and I like to build, right? So and fortunately, at least in software, that requires very little investment. You can uh, get a computer, you're connected to the internet, and cost of software has gone down. I know AWS runs a great program. We have a lot of our products available for free as well. So there's so many resources available to build, and I think a lot of people get stuck in the mechanics of building a company. Like raising money is attractive, hiring people is attractive, getting an office space is attractive, but those things are, they come in much later versus just starting to build something. And I've always been a builder, right? Like if asked to do something, I would just go write code or build an interface. I think the second thing for me was always, like dialing that attribute down and really focusing on, problems that exist around me. And, there are problems that I knew I could solve, and there are problems that are way above my, intelligence level. So I knew I could solve a problem for developers because, I've been a developer and I knew those problems very well. But it still took a lot of like, trying to understand things at a deeper level to be able to translate that into, kind of what to build. And I feel like a lot of people skip that step. I think Steve Blank talks about customer development as a discipline that founders have to learn. Like, how do you put a product in front of customers, have them really respond to it versus a presentation? And I feel like that's something that I kind of really honed in on after, my first startup. Um, and I think, the final thing I would say is that people really think of teams as, just, hey, if I just get a couple of co-founders or I get a technical person or I get like a person to sell, I will be off to the races. But, team building is this continuous journey that you have to keep doing. So once you've kind of got your, first prototype, your skill set ready, you have tested this out in front of the market, then you need to really have a team because they're going to carry on those loops to successively build a better product. So I focused on these three things, before any of the company building stuff really started. And I found out that you can do that, around the world. Like, in fact, I'm a big believer that the closer you are to your eventual users or customers problem, you're better positioned to solve it versus, somebody sitting in the US thinking about problems, 10,000 miles away. Like, if you're closer to your user, you're closer to your customer, you have, you can eventually gain a technology advantage. But, nobody would understand, someone's problems better. And I think we have seen that with the growth of startups that are coming across the world.
So listening to you sounds like, and correct me if I'm interpreting this wrong, but sounds like you turned frugality from a liability into an asset. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Constraints help. Embrace constraints is one of our values, right? You look at the constraints around you, and you look at what problems you can solve. Like, all of us could have, like, yeah, we could all have more funding, better teams, better technology, but you don't have time. Time is always running away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. Great advice. Okay, so why don't we start to geek out a little bit? Let's just dial 10% geekiness for a moment. Let's talk about the API market. Can you give us a brief overview of how you see the past of the API market, where we are, and how do you see it evolving over time?
Yeah, that's happy to. So, from our vantage point, where we think we saw the world was really from a developer lens, which was very underserved when it came to developer tooling or systems for developers to help build better APIs. And honestly, around 2010 or before that, there was not much, that was happening. APIs were pretty much, like these integration tools, like you would hire like a service bus, software to connect your different applications together, or you had maybe, some public APIs that you were using. But what we have seen is really that APIs are the building blocks of future software, of all modern software. And with, like, I would think of AWS S3, for example, right? Like, if I have S3 now, I don't need to care about storage anymore. I can just use a bunch of endpoints and get my app to be much more powerful. I think the same with Stripe or PayPal for payments and a bunch of other things. So I think we saw like the early hints of that, in the 2010s when Postman kind of started getting that adoption. What developers really wanted was, better developer experience, tools that were customized for designing, documenting, testing APIs. And we're still very early. We see in our latest surveys, we have seen that more and more developer time is actually spent on working with APIs versus writing just raw code. Like, even if you're within a large company, you still have to integrate with the systems that the company has, and they're all exposed through APIs. So, from our early days where we just focused on the developer experience, I think we have made a lot of progress towards that. I think now what we are seeing is that every company is modernizing towards, becoming a digital company, whether it's the technology sector or the non-technology sector. APIs have become key abstractions, whether it's banking, healthcare, retail. And, some of these APIs are available as products as well. So I can go and go integrate with a big Fortune 500 company in just a few seconds, which was just unthinkable before. So I think going forward, what's good for us as consumers is that we'll see a lot of useful software ahead of us. And I feel like the API market as such was very much focused on the infrastructure side, which is all useful, but the market is also much broader and it's kind of growing by the day on what APIs eventually enable. And that's where Postman wants to play a key role, especially with things that we have launched recently called the public API network, or our Flows product. So we stand for the developer. We always look at the product from their lens, and there's still a lot of growth ahead as these transformations continue to take place across industry verticals, across geographies. And I think the final thing I would say is that even in India, I think India has been a leader in actually providing APIs for public good. The UPI payment interface, the Aadhaar APIs are all fantastic examples of how it's not just the benefits of APIs are not just limited to the technology industry. They are much broader, and they will cover the entire fabric of society.
Okay. APIs are super interesting. For us, it's part of the AWS origin story, right? Just thinking of Amazon pivoting to an API first mindset. But I think Postman was founded a little bit more than 8 years ago, if I'm correct. So there's a little bit of a visionary move, and I'm sure a little bit of luck as well, but for sure some visionary as well. What was your expectation of the API space? Did you started to see like the beginning of a very aggressive trend, or just personal passion and then luck? What was the mix there?
Yeah, it was a personal pain point. I saw that so many companies were really focusing on purely the enterprise set of scale of problems, which was all, probably good for them, but they were not good for the developer. So I really started looking at solving, our own pain points that we saw, when I was working at my previous company. I was at Yahoo for a little bit, where I worked with my co-founder. That's where we met. And we saw that really developer tooling, developer experience, discovery of APIs, API governance are all kind of like things that even companies who are building APIs at scale really don't have the right tools for. Like they're kind of doing it ad hoc. As APIs were growing more and more in prominence, the need for Postman also grew along the way. So I was honestly surprised by the excitement that developers have. They could save a few hours every week. They were saving so much time on collaboration with other teams that it was you always place a hypothesis and then you see how the market reacts. We were honestly very happily surprised. And I think along the way we have seen that this API problem, and I'm guessing the same would be at like AWS or Amazon. It's massive in scale. You have hundreds of thousands of teams building thousands of endpoints and securing them, making sure that each of those APIs have a great developer experience, obey security governance rules, are functionally correct, are available for people to discover internally and externally, are huge problems that honestly we were we thought we had solved a few of those, but then as we have kind of started serving bigger customers, we've just seen that the problem is even bigger than what we thought of. And along the way we are partnering with AWS, we're partnering with other companies as well to make sure that whatever customers have invested in, they can bring along. We have an integration with the AWS API gateway. We have other gateways as well that are partnering with us. And we saw that there are very distinct personas here who, each of these companies serve. And really, we found our sweet spot here, which we felt, we have differentiated capabilities in. So honestly, for us, it's been a great journey, and partnering with a lot of companies to solve this problem, and we are seeing a great reaction from the market.
Great. Perhaps I would ask you to define a couple of things. I think it's going to be useful for everyone to follow us. How would you define API, and how would you define API first?
It's a good question. Yeah. So API is, an API stands for Application Programming Interface. The way I look at it is that it's the outer boundary of your software that gives you like these configuration knobs to then use the software the way you use it. So just like the way you have a user interface for humans, to tap on or click buttons on, an API exposes these interface points through which machines can interact with other machines. And APIs have always existed. The context of APIs that at least Postman talks about are web APIs that can be called over the network versus your source code library APIs, which are very much local. So that's how I kind of look at an API. And an API first, what we define API first as, it's a philosophy on how you treat APIs as a key strategic asset in your company. That goes then back to your development philosophy. A lot of companies used to think about APIs at the very end of the software development lifecycle, but with a view of APIs being a strategic asset, being a key building block of software. API first companies think about the API very much at the beginning. So they define the key stakeholders of using that software. They define how that software will be used through APIs. How will that be built through the internal services, as well as what are the consumers externally. So looking at that at scale across the portfolio of services that you're providing through APIs, that is what API first means at a company level. At a team level, API first is just understanding that the development practices you're going to follow are in line in eventually producing a great API very much from the beginning, versus slapping on an interface at the very end, because of which you might have many problems down the road.
And as you work with many companies across the world, are you seeing a small percentage, a large percentage of companies that are thinking API first at this point? Like, is this at the beginning of an adoption cycle, or middle, or late?
Yeah, very, very early, I would say. I think a lot of leaders are, they want to be API first categorically. I think they lack, the skill set, in-house. API first requires great API design skills, great architecture skills that are in short supply today. But it requires understanding of your core capabilities as a business. So we see that there's a lot of recognition to solve these specific things, but very few companies are really operating in that API first mindset. A lot of companies think they're operating in the API first mindset, but as we go and talk to our customers, they really find out the gaps in their process. I think what we have been able to do is really bring, we aggregate all this information up and kind of make it digestible for some of our customers and take them through that journey. But I would say most companies are really right now API aware. About 5 years ago, 6 years ago, I would say most companies were API last. They were like, what is an API? I don't even know what an API is. Why should I care? But I think companies like Amazon, Salesforce have really shown, so much, advantage you get with API first, that I think now many companies are kind of in the middle bucket, with very few companies, I think, really adopting API first.
So as you and the team in Postman are maturing and educating and helping people understand around the API first, is this mostly bottoms-up work that you do with the developer teams in education and support, or is this more like a top-down education with leadership so they invest, or both? Like, how are you thinking of audiences and your role shaping and maturing these markets?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we actually wrote a book about it. It's written by Postman's chief evangelist, Ken Lane, called The API First Transformation. And we do both. We found out that if you only focus on technical attributes of building APIs, they are not very successful because they lack the business context of why you're doing that in the first place. So we operate at two levels now. One is educating leadership on why APIs are important for your business. For some businesses maybe it's not the right time, but for a lot of businesses we are finding out they want to modernize, they want to have they want to adopt more of the cloud, they want to get more lines of businesses. So they really understand that, okay, we need to be API first. But at that point, Felipe, we're probably talking about their business and how APIs relate to that. And we try to bridge it then with kind of feet on the ground, like engineers who are really building those APIs to understand the technical challenges that they would have. And sometimes they are purely technical, sometimes there are people challenges. Something as simple as who is the owner of an API. Just identifying that person gets technical teams moving much faster. So we like to we have a set of programs very similar to, I'd say, how you'd probably be doing developer relations, which is focused on developers, really giving them the tools of the trade. We have found developers to be very I'd say they have a shorter attention span, so they like the tools right in their hands, so we can only teach them, through specific channels. We also have a great student program that, we have thousands of student experts around the world, in hundreds of schools. And we found out that, students are very receptive to getting these skills in the market. We also established a lab, an API lab, where I studied in BITS Pilani, and that's been usually successful. So we have invested a lot in developer education, which is bottoms up. And we're also investing a lot in executive education, which is either getting executives together, writing that book, sharing white papers on how other companies have done, these transformations well. And when these things come together, we've seen massive alignment and massive value unlock for our customers.
Okay, great. So I propose that we dial down the geekiness factor and we move maybe to business for a moment. I saw the Okta report on growth. Congratulations.
Thank you.
The icon of a rocket is very connected to where you are and the speed that you're moving. So that seems great. I'm just wondering, how do you think of audience growth, either developer or more business audiences? You have very aggressive goals. I think you want to quadruple your reach, at least on the developer side. How do you think of feeding this meteoric rise?
Well, we are big believers that eventually APIs are going to be a fundamental skill for all knowledge workers. APIs in some ways represent knowledge, right? Like you want to see the weather, there is a weather API. You want to get financial stats, you have APIs for that. So for the modern knowledge worker, getting up to date, verified, trusted information, and being able to use the digital tools they have at their disposal to make them more productive is going to be a fundamental skill. And we believe it's going to be like math, or like Excel, or document writing for that matter, right? Or email. Like it's going to be as fundamental. And we've seen actually in our data that non-developers, or I should say, like non-technical workers sometimes are some of our biggest power users in a lot of companies. They've been given APIs to access or get their work done, and they use Postman for that. So we've been investing a lot in tools on two dimensions. One is our job is to bring these amazing APIs in an easily consumable form to them, which we are doing through the public network. That's a place where any company for free can just create a public workspace on Postman, put their APIs, and they become accessible to the millions of developers and non-developers now on the Postman platform. I mean, we call them builders now to just combine them. Like these people are basically building. And we are also investing in tooling. We introduced this no code, low code product called Flows that allows you could always make a single API call with Postman without knowing how to code, but constructing together a workflow was a problem. So Flows solves for that. It also gives you great visualizations to output the data you have instead of reading JSON, XML text. So we are very excited about these two initiatives, which we have seen tremendous response with, and people are responding. So we are very excited about what people are doing with the product. There's a very clear need for API publishers to also bring in more and more people. The more consumers exist for APIs, the better all of us benefit. So we're seeing a lot of synergies with the rest of the market. And but yeah, overall we go back to the basics, right? Like, have you built a great product? Is the user experience simple enough? Can people start quickly? Is it providing value? So I think through that, we want to continue our growth trajectory. And it's good to get that recognition, but we measure ourselves against the value we are creating versus benchmarks. But it's always good to get recognized.
That's great. Perhaps my last question, a bit more generic. You were talking about a few books and recommendations that you do around essentialism, simplicity, frugality, like that family of things. I wonder, are there any other books that are almost like the common books that you give away to people that you really appreciate? Like, what would be the most gifted one or two books in the business sense?
That's a hard question, depending on who you want to give the book to. But there are three books that I always share with people that's kind of in some ways required reading at Postman. So the first one is Creativity Inc., which is by Ed Catmull. He talks about Pixar, how they fostered creative culture, which is like, I always loved Pixar movies. I've seen like all of them multiple times, and you still go back and see the level of detail that they have. And in my previous life in college, like at one point I interviewed for DreamWorks as an intern, and I thought I would get into the animation industry. Never, I failed. I didn't get in. I failed the interview. But since then I've stayed in touch. Like so that's one book that really talks about candor, how to give feedback, especially when there's such high stakes involved with creative work. So I'd recommend reading that. The Wright brothers, which is how the invention of the airplane, which I was always fascinated by. The interesting insight from that book was, like, everybody was trying to build a more powerful engine, while the Wright brothers were basically focused on gliding. So they focused on building a better glider, and they understood the fundamentals of space flight, and they could strap on an engine later, versus all the inventions of those eras which were focused on just building a more powerful engine, right? And that always goes back to, like, sometimes you could have a lot of money, you could build a lot of technology and still end up solving the wrong problem. So I like to, and they've worked in a lot of constraints, by the way. I think it's just crazy, like how space flight was invented. And I like that story a lot. And I think the third book I give out to a lot of people is High Output Management by Andy Grove, which really taught me how to be a better manager. And that's was kind of my transition as a developer who would spend a lot of time behind the computer screen, and I found comfort in that versus the messy realities of people. And High Output Management taught me that it's more structured. It's something that you need to practice, and you kind of keep getting better at it. But I often go to that book even now. Like, if I feel like I've encountered an issue, I find out some line in that book that's always there. So it's kind of like one of those books that, like, every word is worth its weight, and it's a small book. So I go back to that often, and I tell all my managers, especially new managers, to read it.
Oh, I feel terrible because I haven't read a single one of the three books. So I'm clearly
well,
not Postman material.
Three great book recommendations.
I'll read those three. The recommendations that I always do are 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, Crucial Conversations, and Essentialism. And I think that
I've read the first one.
Okay.
I like that a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, but
And
I'll follow
I'm going to
your
read Essentialism.
Okay, I'm glad. I'm actually gonna send it to you in a moment, so you can take a
Thank
look.
you.
I hope you read Kindle. That's how I read, so I
Oh,
hope you
yeah.
do as well. Okay, I think we're at the end of our discussion. Abhinav, I just want to thank you for your time, for your willingness to share around your story, Postman, the industry, some tips even we were able to get. So just appreciate your time. It was a pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me, Felipe. This was great.
Thank you.